Books teach us, they inspire us, they challenge us, and they expand our horizons. Books contain the best thoughts of the greatest minds in history, but the problem is, there are millions to choose from. So what should you invest your time reading? What should you spend your money on? How do you sort through all the bullshit and find the good shit? You let the superior men do the work. Matt and Jay take the best books, pick the most important points, and distill them down to a concentrated 30-minute podcast. We help you find the books you need to read and why you need to read them. You may even learn something. So take out your coffee, tea, a glass of wine, or a good IPA. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Welcome to the Superior Men Bookcast.
Welcome back to the Superior Men Bookcast. I am your host, Jay, here in the virtual studio with my fellow bookcaster and intellectual, Sir Matthew.
Good day to all of you.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today we have a spectacular bookcast ahead of you. We are talking about Machiavelli's The Prince. But very briefly, before we get into that, we just want to, first of all, thank you all for listening to our bookcast. Make sure you share this bookcast with at least one friend, or an enemy, or a frenemy.
Frenemy.
Yes. We just want you to make sure to help somebody else get smarter. Like, that's our goal in life. And in the case of this particular book, wow, there's so much to expand your brain on. Matt, The Prince, Machiavelli.
So,
talk to us about this book.
Yeah, published in 1532. 15 with a 1-5. 1532. Actually, after Niccolo Machiavelli's death. So this book, and you may not have heard of The Prince, but you've certainly heard of Machiavelli. So 100%. So this book is basically, it is one of the most famous books about politics. And it was, and Jay and I have been talking, but it's really one of the things where it's about Italian politics 500 years ago, which, as you're reading it, you go, that's like today. It's pretty much just like today.
It feels absolutely modern.
Yeah, it does. I mean, except obviously there's translated. There's a little bit dated. Some of the translation or whatever. But it absolutely is. And it talks about the things that are real and actual, as opposed to the things that we always strive for. We strive for truth and honor and justice. So really. Machiavelli spent 14 years on a war council with the Italian city-state of Florence. And just a quick note, Italy wasn't a country until the mid-1800s. Just so you know, it was a collection of city-states before then. So when people say that all the countries in Europe are much older than the United States, not true for Italy.
Which is really fascinating. Those of you who are fans of The Godfather and crime and mobs in general will look at the way that Florence operated back then and realize that families had way more power often than the entire government of an area. They had the
power. All right, so who's going to benefit most from reading this book, Jay?
Who's going to benefit most? Anyone who wants to become more powerful, anyone who wants to protect themselves and their loved ones, kind of similarly to the idea of having a gun. What's more valuable than a gun? Knowledge and information, and this book has it in spades.
And a gun. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, and arms are, as we'll discuss, arms are a big part of this book. Anyone who believes the world is a kind, gentle, and safe place, and any scholar or student of the dark art of politics. Who won't like The Prince?
So anybody who thinks that the world is gentle and kind, that it has to be. Anybody who needs to classify a black and white thinker, so it's either all right or all wrong. If you have firm religious backgrounds, this is gonna just chafe you the wrong way. If you only watch Disney movies, this isn't going to work for you. So how about the book? How's this book to read here, Jay? Since you just read it.
It's going to hurt. It really is. I did. I just read it. How long is it? I know it is about 120 pages, but it took me about 7 hours to read.
Right.
And part of the challenge is the book itself is easy to read, and I'm going to recommend the Harvey Mansfield translation. There are probably a dozen translations out there. There's maybe 4 or 5 really big ones. I really like the Mansfield translation because it has a whole bunch of footnotes. We're talking about 500-year-old Italian history and politics, and it takes time for them to learn. But I would say the biggest challenge is actually wrestling with his amoral and sometimes flat out immoral political advice.
Right. Absolutely.
So easier to read, harder to absorb, and even harder to go like, is this real? Like, is this how you're supposed to do stuff? It's harsh.
Well, and I remember because I listened to the book, and there's basically audio versions that run from 2.5 hours to 5 hours. I listened to one that was 4.5 or so hours long. But I remember getting like wrapped up in the middle of it, and then having to remind myself that this was 500 years old. So as far
totally
as
interesting that way.
Yeah, it really is. So as far as how well known this book is, I mean, it's been out a few years. But I think we kind of there's been a recent resurgence with it. It's kind of hard to really gauge this as far as how popular the book is, because it's really going to be based on the translation. Unless you speak Italian. If you speak Italian, read the original text. Or read Italian, then that's what you should be doing. I don't, so I rely on the translation. But basically, we have like 4.5 stars, maybe 5,000 to 6,000 reviews. It's spread out over the dozen or so versions that are out there, because there's multiple translations, and then there's even more versions of those translations. Right. So and basically, it's in a lot of the single digits as far as philosophy, history on Amazon. It's I think. Significance number 92 on Audible for the entire category of classic literature, which that's pretty significant, because this would definitely be in that. So all right, Jay, how'd you find out about the book?
I have heard about this book for a long time, and the term Machiavellian politics I've heard ever since I studied anything about politics.
Right.
But I've literally never read the book until this week. This is the first time I've ever read it. And that was partially because it was something that you put on our to read list on Superior Men Superior Men website, which, by the way, www.wearesuperiormen.com. Fantastic material there, and under our books list, you can see that as one of the title headings on our webpage. We have a bunch of great books there, and this is one that's been on there for a while, and we've discussed it. And finally, I'm like, you know what? It's time.
Let's do it.
I'm so sad that I have not read it before, because it's just been it's really opened my eyes to how anybody that thinks that we get smarter as a nation over time, and that we learn a lot more new things over time.
No, you don't.
I'm not 100% sure about that.
You just have different tools to do it, and this kind of proves it. That it's just like, well, instead of swords and stuff, you have stealth fighters or something. I mean, really. So,
right. What about you? Where'd you get it? Where'd you find out? Or when did you first start reading it? How's that?
I read it first, a little over 4 years ago. And actually, I had to look back in Audible, and it was May of 2016. But it's funny because I came about it via 48 Laws of Power, which is, I think, probably the opposite. I think probably I don't know, maybe. 48 Laws of Power is a very, very significant book. But this was referenced so many times in that book. And I was like, well, let's go ahead and check that book. Oh, it's really short. Okay, then. So
that is it's a bonus, man. It really is.
Yeah.
And that's not an accident. The book is written, as we'll talk about here in a second. It is written to be short and simple on purpose because of who it's written for.
So give us a little bit about Machiavelli, about the author.
Okay, so Machiavelli
briefly.
I'm just going to do the 20-minute version,
just
as quick as I can. As Matt was referencing, this gentleman is 500 years old. He was an Italian Renaissance diplomat, philosopher. Yes?
No, I was just saying he's not 500 years old. He's dead.
Oh, good point.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. It depends on who you ask, but we're pretty sure that he's dead. Philosopher, historian, playwright, lived in Florence during the end of the 15th and early 16th century. He was born in a very chaotic time in Italy, which, because Italy didn't exist as a formalized country, shifting city-states were the local and regional governments of those parts of Italy. So that not only were they battling each other, they were also battling with France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. So everything was shifting, and power would gain and be lost sometimes within a few months, and nothing was stable. Machiavelli was raised in a family, the Machiavelli family. His father was a lawyer, and that was really interesting because nowadays, if you're a lawyer, you're pretty legit and you have some power. Back then, that was basically nothing. He had no political influence. His father and himself never were granted Florentine citizenship. So he basically had to get power by his own bootstraps, and he did it. He went, worked his way up through school and became an advisor to the Florentine Council for Diplomacy and Warfare, and traveled throughout Italy and even to Spain and France and other places throughout Europe during his 14 years in power, until Medici family came back. Medici's kicked him out, dissolved the Republic of the city-state, and accused him of conspiracy, had him banished, arrested, and tortured. And he spent the rest of his life outside of government, but he loved it, loved politics, and wanted to get back into it, which is why he wrote The Prince. The Prince is written to Lorenzo de' Medici, one of the young princes of the Medici family, and it was designed specifically to teach him how to become a prince and stay in power in this very, very chaotic and difficult time. Last little footnote here: both The Prince and Discourses on Livy, and in fact all of his books on politics, none of them were popular during his lifetime, although he was popular as a comedic and romantic playwright.
Well, there you go. Man, a Renaissance man, right?
In every sense of the word. Yeah.
All right.
Let's tell us about the book here, the themes.
Yeah. Let's look at some of the themes here. So, he talks a lot about free will. So he talks a lot about, fortune, because there was definitely a thought during that time. It's like everything, you sort of have fate, and things were going to be preordained, and that's just what it was. He talks about cruelty, and cruelty is an interesting one because really he is talking about, the thought and the idea of it's better to have somebody fear you than love you comes from Machiavelli. And it's really because love is, if they love you and they honor you and you always see that, but really the better thing is for them to fear you. Because people are much easier to control when that happens. As far as arms, weapons, he's saying princes should be men and animals. You should be intellectual and a warrior. You should be strong like a lion and cunning like a fox. And you should always use your own troops and not rely on mercenaries. And I think that has been just proved over and over again throughout history. Also, that you should understand history. You should be able to understand what great men have done and learn from their successes and failures. Generosity This one's interesting because it's definitely contrary to I think what we normally say, but basically generosity is dangerous for a prince. You should it's better to be thought of as a miser than to just kind of give freely. And then lastly, he talks a lot about the unification of Italy, which is sort of what we had talked about too. Italy was city-states, which city-state really, you're like, oh, that's a flashback from, middle school, junior high history class or something. But it's like its own country. So the city was its own country. So during this time, this would have been the feudal time in, like, say, England with castles, and you had a lord and they had their castle and their spot. That's pretty much the same kind of idea that Italy had as well.
Yeah, you just imagine the United States without any federal government, and every individual state in the nation is now their own country, and they all are trying to get bigger.
But even smaller than that too. It'd be like L.A., Los Angeles is its own country with its own government, and San Diego is its own government. And they're disputing over the Orange County. There's some regional some hot Southern California talk.
That's actually, I was going to say, we're trying to talk to our national listeners here.
Yeah.
But you're right. It actually geographically is even a smaller space than it would be for the United States. The United States is huge. Italy's just one space. So it's really you're fighting your neighbors and the city next door.
Constantly. All right, so let's talk about Jay. What did you like best about this book?
I will have to say that this is probably the best book on politics I've ever read.
Right.
And it feels like a guidebook for 21st century politics. Right. I literally went back through as I'm reading this book and opened up my Twitter and started looking at kind of like through the lens of the prince, looking at how Trump does some of his politics, how Biden's been doing his politics, but how various different kind of people in power are pushing things around, and like the methods that they're using. And it's like, oh wow, this guy's just calling it. Niccolo's a genius. So yeah.
Well, it's the more things change, the more they kind of stay the same. All right, so give us a quote or two that you enjoyed.
All right. I have two quotes, and they're probably both going to irritate you a little bit. At least I hope so. All the armed prophets conquered, and the unarmed ones were ruined. For the nature of people is variable, and it's easy to persuade them of something, but difficult to keep them in that persuasion. And thus, things must be ordered in such a mode that when they no longer believe, one can make them believe by force.
Yep. That goes with what they're saying. Having a control over a population is it makes for long lasting government. I mean, as far as your power staying there. What else?
Yep,
what's your other quote?
Absolutely, and this is highly connected to that. Men will always turn out bad for you unless they have been made good by a necessity.
Right.
That's
a nice view on human nature, right? So again, this is more of a reality, less of a but they could be good. All right, so what did you learn from the book?
Yeah, it's definitely a book about seeing things how they actually are. And it's also an issue. This is not written for the common person. This is written for somebody who's going to be at the highest level of power, dealing with the most level of bullshit from the people underneath him.
Right.
And there's never going to be like an equal playing field where everybody's going to be like, you're cool, I'm cool, we're all good, man. Like it made me, this is probably the thing that made me change the most in the reading of this book. It made me ask this question: is changing the status quo ever going to be unopposed? Was any nation or territory, or even nowadays thought space, was it ever truly unoccupied before it was ruled? So we have this question a lot in the concept of America. We took over the land from Native Americans. We took it over from the French. We took it over from the Spanish. We took it over from England. And we should never have done that. Some people will argue that. So this question of, well, all of it was owned by somebody else, and all the freedoms and the great things that you experience as a result of your new country all basically always come at the expense of somebody else. So should you do that? Should you take over somebody else's space if yours is better? It's a great question.
Right. Yeah, and again, when you're talking city-states and his time, it wasn't like going, to war, 3,000 miles away. It was, 20 miles away, and then you'd be going. All right, so what did you like least? I just want to comment on the Machiavellian side, which is what most people, people use that term Machiavellian as a pejorative. It is a negative thing. This guy's scheming. He's evil. He's lying, deceiving, backstabbing. He's just a bad person. And that kind of politics, ends justify the means, is just evil. And as I've gotten older, I've got to the point where I'm like, no, that's just people. That's just power. And good and evil are always relative. This book is not going to tell you what to do or what not to do from a moral sense. So if you can read it in that sense, I think that Machiavelli has a tremendous amount to teach us, because he's a history teacher more than anything else. I would love to have him come back and write another book right now. Like, right. Come back from the dead and write another book. And this one's updated, but instead of talking about Julius II and Alexander the 11th and Benito Cesare, I want him to talk about all of the modern. I want him to talk about Trump. I want him to talk about Zuckerberg. I want him to talk about. And it'll be all exactly the same.
And the same. Yep. Yeah. I pretty much feel like that's the case.
Yeah. All right, so what questions would you ask the author?
Most people have no idea that Machiavelli wrote comedic plays, romantic poetry, long histories, as well as The Prince and his, the political commentary that he put in there. I'd like to say, which was the most fun for you to write? What did you enjoy the most?
Cool. Any any related or connected books?
It's a number of fantastic ones. Of course, Green's book that you were referencing earlier. I really like the book Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, which is a book about how marketers and salespeople convince you to buy stuff without you being aware of it. I think that that's a really great one that's very connected to this. And I also really like one of our earlier podcasts, Never Split the Difference, which is about convincing people to get what you want. I think Never Split the Difference could be combined with The Prince as a way of having a more moral take on taking over people. But still, it's about power.
Yeah.
So, all right. That's kind of my perspective. Matt, give me your background here. What do you like best about The Prince?
So I really liked, I liked reading it, that it was 500 years old and felt like it could have been, written 2 years ago, or today. I love all the insights that are contained in it, like little nuggets of wisdom. If you just search for The Prince quotes or something like that on Google, like, there's just so many good little nuggets of information. And then as you're reading some of those quotes, you're like, whoa, I agree or I disagree or whatever. And it's like, that's the cool thing. And I really like being able to go through and be challenged by something that I read. So I would say that's big for me.
It's super cool that the Prince can be so potent 500 years later. It really makes you go, oh, damn it, what in my history class, like, why did they screw it up so badly?
Right.
Because history is super interesting and actually valuable as well. Give me a quote or two here.
So I have two. I have two short ones. So the first one is, everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. And that really has deep roots in our modern psychology. or our modern psychology has deep roots into that kind of thinking, where, you know, you have sort of your outer self and your inner self, and what you appear to be is pretty much what everybody's seen, but not who you actually are. So I love that quote.
And I would say very valuable for the modern era, where we know what somebody's Facebook looks like and their Instagram, and, you know, kind of what they look like on the outside, but what are they really underneath? So that's great. What's the other one?
The other one is: the first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him.
Great.
And I mean, you hear that all the time in modern politics. You go, you know, here's, you know, the presidential candidate, but then you go, hey, who's around him? You know, who's advising him or her? You know, what that the group that surrounds them almost says more about that person than anything they say. Because, you know, if I choose to be around this person, or, you know, this person is an advisor to me, then that says a lot about me, and where my priorities are. So I love that, because that's 100% true.
Oh, that's a fantastic quote. All right, what do you learn from this book?
So I like the fact where you can, the challenge of seeing people for who they're trying to be, not, and who for maybe who they really are, trying to dive a little bit deeper, kind of going off that last quote, where really, like, who are you really, and what are you really trying to do? And then the whole part about trying to gain power and hold power, and what is involved in all of that. Because I think that for most of us, that's way far above anything that we're ever going to do. But there's some, you know, as far as, like, you're not going to, you know, most of us aren't going to be the president of the United States, or what, you know, governor, or whatever, almost any elected office. But really, this is very, it speaks to your motivations. It speaks to how that actually works. Very similar to, like, 48 Laws of Power.
Well, what's really interesting to me about this is that this book, along with 48 Laws of Power and a handful of others, are very accurate in their description of admitting, guess what? Men want power. That's a thing that we want it, and we need it. It's valuable for us to have it. And if you're not spending some time thinking about, like, gaining power and holding power, you are losing that power. Somebody else has power over you.
Yep.
So super important to think about. What did you like least?
I don't have a critique. I really I sat on this one for quite a while. I don't really. I enjoy just about every aspect of this book. I don't. There's not really anything that stands out to me that is a significant flaw.
Wow, that's 500 years old, and it's pretty close to perfect.
Yeah.
What questions would you ask Machiavelli?
So I would love,
if you had him, if you took him out for some IPA.
Yeah, I would.
Actually, probably wine, no doubt.
I would love to hear his take on. I would love to hear his compare and contrast from 500 years ago Italian city-states to modern politics, whatever, global politics, because I think the idea of global politics to somebody from dealing with city-states would be a very interesting take, and I'd love to hear him just go, like, what the hell? It's like the same thing. But
wouldn't that be fantastic to have Machiavelli on like a show, where, like, as a famous name, where he'd be just, like, tearing everybody apart? That would be, I would watch that show in a second.
Yeah, same here.
Connected books, related books that you'd recommend?
So 48 Laws of Power. If you haven't read either one of these, you should read both. If you want a quick starter, 48 Laws of Power sounds like a lot of laws and a lot of things. I would go here with The Prince first. It's condensed, but not as broad as 48 Laws of Power. But 48 Laws of Power is definitely it, by Robert Greene.
Amazing book. All right, final thoughts here, Matt, on The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli.
Yeah, like I said, you definitely need to read this book. If you listen to it, and, I mean, if you want to geek out, there's so many different translations. I say it doesn't matter. Get something and read it. I mean, you're kind of, it's going to be splitting hairs, I'm sure. But if you really want to study it, I know Jay has some suggestions here. But listen to this book, read this book, keep a copy of this book.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I agree. I agree that pretty much any version of this book is going to be way better than knowing it. I like the Mansfield translation because of all the footnotes and gives you just so much more insight as to what's happening. Because 500 years ago, unless you're a huge history buff, you probably don't know. This will help get you up to speed quickly. But overall, yeah, couldn't agree more. Thank you, Matt, for making this book one of the books on our book list. And thank all of you for listening. Please share this podcast with a friend and help them to become a little bit more Machiavellian. We appreciate you, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for listening to the Bookcast. On behalf of Matt, my name is Jay. We'll see you next time.
A reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies. The man who never reads lives only one. Thank you for listening to the Superior Men Bookcast. Share it with a friend. You heard our thoughts. Go read it for yourself.